I have been, over the last 6, 7 Sunday nights, I've been going over a subject of holiness. I wrapped that up. I don't have enough to really put another lesson on that, so I'm just going to get into something else here tonight. And because it's going to be broken up on Sunday nights from now through Christmas, we'll just do some select things here and there when the Sunday nights allow over the next few weeks. It gives me some flexibility to do that, not stuck to a series. I want to look at what happens when someone hurts us. What happens? How do we respond? What do we see as a biblical example of that when we get hurt? I'm talking someone says something to offend us, something says something to really upsets us in some way, or goes out of their way to hurt us somehow. How do we respond? I think we have a good example of that in this passage, and we'll look at some other ones as well. In 1 Samuel 18, let me read the first part of this chapter as kind of our text, and then we're going to go back and look at a couple verses leading up to this. But 1 Samuel 18, came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day, would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, his garments, even his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. David went out whithersoever Saul sent him. He behaved himself wisely. Saul set him over the men of war. He was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet the King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music. The women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s. To me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow. I want you to notice that as we get it. The next day. It came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. And he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times. And there was a javelin in Saul's hand. Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him, made him his captain over 1,000. He went out, came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself wisely, he was afraid of him. Turn back, while we have the Bibles open right there, turn back to the end of chapter 16. End of chapter 16, verse 17. Chapter 16, 17, Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of his servants and said, Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, a mighty valiant man, a man of war, prudent in matters, a comely person. The Lord is with him. Wherefore Saul sent his messengers unto Jesse and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. Jesse took an ass laden with bread, bottle of wine, a kid, sent them by David his son unto Saul. David came to Saul, stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp, played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So we have the introduction of young David, the harp player, in the court of Saul at the end of chapter 16. Saul was not aware of this young man, but many of the other people in his array of people there were aware of him. They knew who he was. He had a reputation. So they beckoned for David to come, and he came, and he began to play a harp for Saul. In chapter 17, we have the story of David and Goliath. And it begins with the fact that David is not now with Saul. David is home. David is watching the sheep. No doubt because Saul and his men were pitched down on the valley there, fighting the Philistines. David wasn't at the palace. Saul wasn't at the palace. And so David was away, or at his home, because Saul was away fighting. And as we come to chapter 17, Saul can't find anybody willing to go down and to fight. David makes a request to go down. We know that. Saul offers him his armor and stuff, and David won't wear it, won't take it. It's not the right size, and he's not worthy of wearing it. David goes down. He kills Goliath. We know how that story ends up. But at the end of chapter 17, verse 54, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem he put his armor in his tent. Whose armor did David put in his tent? Goliath's, right? He killed him. He cut his head off. He took Goliath's armor as a trophy and put Goliath's armor in his tent. Verse 55, when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistines, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. I don't know who this kid is. Some of your more liberal commentaries, and there's plenty out there, some of your more liberal commentaries say these chapters must be out of order, right? They must be out of order. There's something messed up here in the story. It must not be chronologically correct. Because in chapter 16, David comes and starts to play the harp. In chapter 17, David kills Goliath. And at the end of the chapter, Saul's like, who is this kid? Right? Who is this guy? And I don't know about you, but I've met arrogant people who are better than the peons that are under them and work for them. And they have no care or concern about who the little people are. And in chapter number 16, Saul is given someone to play the harp. He doesn't really know the kid. When he gets mad, his staff ushers the kid in. It says at the end of chapter 16 he loved him. I don't know what all that entails. He liked him. He liked the music he played. He liked the way he felt when the music was playing. But he had David come in and play the harp. When the battle rages, David goes home. He's a kid. He's not going down to the battle. He goes home. He's watching the sheep. When the opportunity comes, he comes back. He checks on things. He goes down. He kills Goliath. He comes back, and Saul looks around and goes, who is this kid? And Abner says, I don't know who he is. Right? And you and I would say, you should know who he is. He worked for you, right? You missed, and I think people like Saul, and you and I might have worked with people like that in years past, or do now, tend to miss the talent right before their eyes. Right before their eyes. I worked with a guy at Sherwin-Williams for years. He was, I've told this story. If you've heard it, it's been years ago, but we had two employees at my store at one point that were named Phil and Gil. Phil and Gil. Phil, former manager of a Bob Evans restaurant, and just couldn't take the hours anymore and the demand. And Gil worked for Bethlehem Steel at one point. And so both these guys were my age or maybe a little older, and were kind of looking for new careers. And both of them had come to work for us. And Gil was working during the day. Phil was doing other stuff, another job during the day, so he'd come and work for us in the evening. Gil, both of them were pretty good workers, but Gil was a complainer. He would gripe all the time. He affected the mood of the entire store. You know, after Gil was there for a couple hours, we were all complaining, you know. And he just had that effect on you. He was a big talker. Gil did. Phil came in the evening. Phil was a hard worker, but Phil was a very positive person. And I'll say this now, Phil was a born-again Christian. But Phil was a very upbeat person, very positive person. We had Gil and Phil. And the bosses at the company never got to know the employees. Unless you were a manager or something, they didn't spend a lot of time getting to know the employees. I think they should have, because I think there was a lot of good talent there among those guys. But the opportunity came for an opening in one of the stores, you know, to go be, I think, an assistant manager down in York. And the boss called me one day. He's like, I know you got a couple guys working there. I think I want that Gil to come over and talk to me. I said, you don't want Gil. You want Phil. Who's Phil? I'm like, I'm telling you, you want Phil. And so we talked a little bit, and then like a week later, he's like, all right, I'm ready. Send that Gil over. I'm like, no. You don't want Gil. I'm telling you, you want Phil. All right, whoever. So I sent Phil over. I did. Long story short, Phil, about 5 years after that, won the biggest award possible on the stage of the national sales meeting as Manager of the Year of 3,000 stores. Because Phil was fantastic. He had a great personality. He knew what he was doing. He was very businesslike. He had run a Bob Evans. And he ran it like he was the right guy. But the bosses didn't even know who he was. The guy who went on to be Manager of the Year was working part-time evenings at my store, and I'm trying to tell him, no, you want this guy. You want this guy. They liked me, but that's fine. I never won Manager of the Year. He won Manager of the Year. He's great at this job. You want him. I think Saul was in that position where, Saul's like, I need somebody to play the harp or something. And so they bring in somebody. And then the next chapter, he's like, you know what I need? We need somebody to go down and kill this giant. It's like, hello? He was in your court. The greatest warrior you'll ever have was playing harp for you. You missed it. And at the end of the whole chapter 17, Saul's looking around saying, who's this kid anyway? Where'd he come from? Saul, you should know. And when Saul does realize finally who he is, of course, because the people are singing his praises, and he's back in his court, he's back. The Bible says that he had played the harp before. That should help us understand the chapter 16, 17, 18 are in chronological order. But he's back in the court. He's playing the harp once again, and Saul's sitting there seething. Because this guy playing the harp is more popular than he is, and Saul says, what's he going to have next? He'll probably take the whole kingdom. And by the next day, he's throwing the javelin at him. He's trying to nail him to the wall with the javelin. The Bible says that David avoided out of his presence twice. I don't know why David went back, right? I mean, after the king throws the javelin at you once, they're like, hey, you want to come play the harp? Not really, I got a better audience, that's a rough crowd. He's trying to kill me. I know you don't say no to the king. That has bad consequences too, but it wasn't looking so good. But he went back. He avoided twice. Listen, David, in these 3 chapters, 16, 17, 18, tells us a couple times, David behaved himself wisely. He was doing everything right. He was stepping up. When the king should have stepped up in some of these situations, David did. David was behaving himself wisely and doing everything right. And yet, we can see he was kind of overlooked. He was ignored. And worst case scenario, they wanted to kill him when they figured out who he was. They wanted him dead. David didn't do anything wrong in this story, did he? In these stories, we'll go later in the book of 2 Samuel and see some things that David did wrong. But in this part, and early in his life, David didn't handle himself wrong in this situation. He handled himself wisely. He behaved himself wisely. He did all the right things. He said the right things. He was a real asset. Saul had gone down a long path of bitterness and of pride and of selfishness. I mean, he had gone way down that rabbit hole. Saul should have used David to the benefit of the kingdom more than he did. He should have wanted to align himself more. He could have looked better. The leader can look better if you have the right staff. And Saul had the right staff, and yet he mistreated him. So I thought David was probably a pretty good example of, why is it sometimes that Christians hurt other Christians? Why do they do that? Why do they say something to offend other Christians? Why? Why do they go out of their way to hurt somebody or to say something rude or mean to somebody or to belittle somebody? Why do they do that? Here in this situation, this was not Saul and David were on the same team, right? The enemy was the Philistines. They're on the same team. And yet, there was some animosity, some hurt. It got to a really bad place. We know that. In fact, over the next 15 to 20 years, Saul's going to be hunting David. And so it doesn't get better. This whole situation continued to get worse. They didn't make amends throughout all this. Why do Christians sometimes hurt other Christians? I wrote down, number one, we're all sinners. Because we're sinners. It always goes back to that. We're sinners. And sinners are going to act in selfish ways. Saul had allowed his pride to overtake him. He had started, Saul is such a contrast, because he started with such humility, right? Such humility that even when God had anointed him, chose him, Samuel had anointed him, God had chosen him, Saul was hiding not trying to, too embarrassed to get up and to take the position and to take the authority that he was given. And yet, by this time, 1 Samuel 16, 17, 18, there's an evil spirit, his pride and his arrogance. He's far away from God. We see such a corruption to his reign as king. He had gone. What caused that? Well, sin, bitterness, anger, pride, animosity. He wanted to keep what he had. He wanted to keep the position he had. He wanted to eliminate any threat to his position, his authority. He was a proud man who wanted to do what he wanted to do. Didn't want to listen to what God had to say. Didn't want to listen to Samuel and God's commands via the prophet. He didn't want any of that. And so often I think we have to remember we're sinners. And as sinners, we're going to have these problems. We're dealing with sinners. We're sinners. We're dealing with sinners. How about 1 Peter chapter 4? 1 Peter chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4, verse 12. 12 and 13. 1 Peter 4, but beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Verse 12, very, very pointed in its instructions, right? Don't think that the trial is unique to you. Don't think that you got singled out because someone hurt you or got upset with you or a problem came your way. We're sinners. We're living in a sinful world. These things are going to be part of it. I wrote down number 2. This might surprise you that I'm saying this, but bear with me on this. We are, by and large, as independent fundamental Baptists, we take strong positions. We stand on our convictions. We're known for standing by our convictions. We don't waver on our convictions. And as such, we tend to be sometimes, bullheaded, strong-opinioned. We tend to we tend to sometimes forget the things that we should stand firmly on, and mix them up with the things that we should be softer on, right? We have positions we don't compromise on, right? We understand that. The Word of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ and virgin birth of Christ, and we go on and on. The doctrines that we do not waver on, these are non-negotiable. And we get upset about, the color of the hymnal. I'm picking something that I don't think anybody's upset about, but that happens in churches, right? The color of the hymnal gets people all wired up. Oh, no. I thought we should have blue ones. I can't believe we have red ones, it's always something like that, right? We've heard those stories, the color of the carpet or the type of the piano or the church van or whatever. People get upset. And they get upset over those type of things. I get people upset all the time over things that we cannot control. That don't like something that you and I would think probably is relatively small, and they leave the church over it. Because we take those things that are not worth fighting over and make a fight over it. And we have a tendency to do that. And I would think we would agree that in 2021, that list of things has gotten even broader. right? In other words, it's not just biblical things. We have political stands that we don't waver on, and we're willing to fight over. We have, vaccine things we're willing to fight over and different opinions on. Mandates and all this stuff and masks or whatever. All these things that are becoming dividing things in our country also divide people in churches. And while, listen, I'm preaching this knowing and believing full well that for the most part, that's not a problem in our church. But I do know that it's becoming problems in families. I know of a number of people that told me, Thanksgiving and Christmas is going to be different this year. They're not welcome at their brother-in-law's house because of their stand on some of the things I just mentioned. And so there's been divisions because of these things. These things are becoming real problems that people are dealing with. You have seen that. I've seen that. I've seen that even in my own family, and I'm sure you have too, that there's just new divisions and new problems and new things that are hurting people because of that. And so we take very strong stands on things. I think that's one of the reasons that we end up getting hurt is because people take such strong positions on things. Some things that don't matter. Some things that don't matter. Number 2 on my list here. What is my response supposed to be? 1 Peter chapter 3. I think we should be right across the page here. 1 Peter 3, verse 8. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing. Contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil, do good, let him seek peace, and ensue it. And so what's my response to be? Well, I'm supposed to return with love and understanding and kindness. That's supposed to be my response. I think, again, going back to our story, what did David do? The javelin came his way. He ducked out of the way. The javelin evidently sailed past him, probably hit the wall. I wonder if there was I think it would be in my initial reaction to pick up the javelin. He who just killed Goliath might be pretty good at returning it, Right? Was that a natural reaction? You throw a javelin at me, I'll pick it up and throw it back. That's not the way the story plays out, right? That's not David's response. He doesn't return the javelin. He doesn't try to kill Saul. Even later on, after he's been pursued for years and he finds Saul in the cave, and his men say, here's your opportunity. There he is. You got him. And David creeps up and cuts the bottom of his robe off, remember? And David is sorry that he did that. He's like, I shouldn't have done that. This is God's anointed. I shouldn't have done that. David did not respond with that same hatred. He did not respond with that same revenge. He didn't. And 1 Peter chapter 3 tells us, watch your tongue, watch the things we say. Be careful with these things. And I'm speaking very freely here. I'm not the only one I know right now that's dealing with this, where, I have people come to me that are anti-vaccine and tell me what they feel, and I go, okay, I understand. And then 2 minutes later, I have someone come to me and say, but I'm pro-vaccine, and people who aren't doing it are da-da-da-da-da, and I go, okay, I understand what you're saying, I understand. I'm in the midst of that all the time. I mean, there's different opinions in this room. I understand that. As a church, I work through that, right? I deal with that in family situations. I have some family members, opposed to stuff that is very important. I have family members that are pro on that. And I'm in the midst of this all the time, so I'm trying to, bite my tongue, be kind, be loving, treat everyone the same, and yet there's very strong opinions coming my way. Not to mention, and hopefully this doesn't surprise you, not to mention, I have my own opinions. I actually have an opinion, I remember this years ago. I still pick on my wife for this. But my wife, I think, has always been very good, especially one of the gifts God has given her as a pastor's wife, is she's very good at just smiling and going on. She doesn't get upset with people. She wants to. I think that's her natural reaction, is to get upset sometimes, but she doesn't. She's very nice, very kind, very understanding, keeps her mouth shut, doesn't argue with anybody. And she had that at work when she worked at the public school. And there was a point after a couple of years, her one coworker said to Desi, well, I guess must be nice not having an opinion on anything. I'm thinking, yeah, I'm her husband. She has an opinion. She has a strong opinion. She's just not arguing with you over it. You know what I mean? She's just not yelling at you over it. And so that's what I'm talking about, that as we're getting, Pastor, why are you teaching this right now? Because we're heading into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we're going to have opportunities here where people are going to be sitting across the table from us, maybe trying to provoke you, maybe trying to nettle you a little bit, maybe trying to get you to go and argue. And, it might be easy to have a blow up over the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table because of your opinion, my opinion, who you like, who you don't like, who's in the White House, who's not in the White House, who should be in the White House, who's got ripped off for not being in the White House, whatever, all these opinions start to come up, and people get all mad and all arguing about these things. And I have it in family situations. You have it. It'll happen at work. It'll happen at your Christmas party. It'll happen somewhere. Listen, it'll happen that you, like David, are kind of going to be caught off guard, and a javelin's going to come your way. Not literally, right? But in someone throwing a barb your way, throwing an argument your way, throwing something your way to get you to fight, to get you to argue. Well, 1 Peter gives us some ideas there of how to respond. Having compassion one of another, not rendering evil for evil. Okay, you're entitled to that. Fine, I understand. Let's move on. I am only responsible for my actions before God. I think that's so important. God holds me accountable for my actions and not for yours. And I use that same line when we have marriage counseling. Because inevitably in marriage counseling, the wife or the husband will tell me what I need to tell their spouse to do better, Always. And I find that amusing now after some 30-some years of marriage, but the wife's like, you have got to tell him that he has to. I had one years ago. I'm at home, phone rings. Pastor, you have to tell my husband that he has to clean the garage tonight. He told me he'd clean the garage. He hasn't cleaned the garage. I'm going to put him on the phone. You tell him he has to clean the garage. I'm like, no, not my job, I'm not telling your husband to clean the garage, It sounds crazy, but people, listen, we get somehow the idea that we're going to, change the other person, fix the other person. Listen, I'm accountable for my actions before the Almighty. God holds me accountable for what I do, for how I act, not for how my neighbor, my friend, my coworker, my spouse acts. That's between them and God. They have their own relationship there. I'm responsible for that. Am I showing Christ's love in this matter? And we know in Romans chapter 12, I'm not going to turn there, God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Right? It's not my job to enact revenge. Right? Again, David did not pick up the javelin and throw it back. We have no record of David ever attacking Saul, going after Saul, trying to kill Saul. He was running from him. Right? He spent all those years running from Saul, trying not to confront him, not attacking him. So, okay, number one was, why do Christians hurt other Christians? Number two, what's my response supposed to be? Number three, how do I turn this around for the glory of God? Right? When those things happen, when someone says something to provoke or to attack or to throw that javelin or to get me upset or to rile me up, how can I turn this around for the glory of God? Number one, not to dwell on it, right? I don't sit there and go, I think the immediate response is I don't storm out, and this is not going to happen, but if I'm sitting at my mom's on Thanksgiving and my brother says something to me that would rile me up, I don't stand up and say, "That's it, I'm leaving." That's not going to fix the problem. It's just not going to. There's a time to discuss things, but then there's a time that we're not going to upset mom. Not going to ruin Thanksgiving for everybody, for the kids. Not going to fight over it. We don't dwell on it. We don't get caught up in those things. We can use this opportunity, I think, after we've been hurt, after we've learned from this, after we've responded. We can use it often to help others and to encourage others, to help others get through maybe a similar thing as they've been hurt and so forth. Romans 8:28, probably one that you know all too well. You can turn there, but you probably know Romans 8:28 off the top of your head. Romans 8:28 so often gets misquoted or misused. I think most pastors refer to Romans 8:28 as the most misused verse in the Bible. Romans 8:28, we know all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And just to be clear, they work out for whose good? They work out for God's good, right? In God's perfect plan. It may not be the way we wanted it to work out, or the way we thought it would come to a resolution, or the way we thought we could wrap it up, or deal with it, or fix it. But it may end up exactly the way God can. And in the midst of listen, I think so often the world is looking for a reaction. And the proper, godly, loving response can go a long way towards building a relationship, towards starting communication, towards showing the love of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially, obviously, to someone who's lost. We can take those opportunities that could be divisive, that could be a problem, that could be an argument of some sort, and we can use that, diffuse that, and make it an opportunity to share the goodness of God in the midst of that situation. I wanted to start with that story in 1 Samuel. I think that gives us a good example of someone who was attacked and hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, he had done everything right, and yet was attacked, but didn't respond with the same anger or animosity or revenge as the one who had attacked him. And I hope that gives just a thought as we're heading into the holiday season, as we're heading into those times when we'll be maybe around some people that might want to nettle us or, argue with us or cause some discord or things like that. I thought that might be some wisdom at this time.